The wind howled like a ghost that night, sweeping through the narrow canyon town of Widow's Rest. Flames licked the cold air as torches were raised high, casting dancing shadows against the wooden walls of the old chapel. At the center of it all stood a girl no older than 17, barefoot on frozen earth, her hands bound and her eyes wide with something beyond fear, betrayal. The townsfolk had already decided her fate. No trial, no defense, only fire. They called her a witch. They claimed she'd cursed the harvest, sickened the cattle, drawn lightning to the preacher's barn. All lies, of course, but lies travel fast when fed by fear. No one spoke for her. Not the pastor who once took her bread. Not the merchant who had watched her grow from a child. They stood there, hard as stone, as if to say, better her than us. The rope had already been soaked in oil, the woodpile stacked high, and then, through the rising smoke and rising rage, he stepped forward. A man most have forgotten. A man who spoke to no one, lived on the outskirts, and came to town only when his tools broke or his mule needed oats. Caleb Ward, the quiet farmer who plowed his land alone and never raised his voice to another soul. The crowd parted as he walked, slow, deliberate, his boots echoing against the cracked stone. No one knew why he came. No one dared to stop him. And when he reached the girl, he didn't plead, didn't shout. He simply removed his glove and took her trembling hand in his, warm and steady. The torches paused. The wind held its breath. And in that moment, something ancient stirred beneath the dust and judgment. Because in the Old West, where justice was often just another word for revenge, one act of quiet courage could fracture an entire belief. Caleb didn't need to know her story to believe in her innocence. He saw it in her eyes, the kind of truth that can't be faked, even when wrapped in panic. And by holding her hand, he made his choice. If they were going to burn her, they'd have to burn him too. No speech, no sermon, just a man, a girl, and a flame that refused to become a fire. The silence that followed was louder than any gallop, heavier than any gunshot. Because when a loner holds your hand in front of a mob, the world changes. What happened next wasn't written in any ledger. No lawman filed a report. But for years to come, the story would be told in whispers and worn into the cracks of old rocking chairs on dusty porches. The day a farmer reminded a town that the difference between a witch and a woman was often just whether anyone dared to stand beside her. For a moment, no one moved. The torches crackled in hesitant fists, wavering like the courage of the men holding them. Caleb Ward stood tall beside the girl, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over the kindling stacked at her feet. His face, weathered by sun and solitude, betrayed no fear, only quiet defiance. The townspeople didn't understand it. Caleb had never spoken at town meetings, never joined in barn dances, never once challenged a decision made by the preacher or the mayor. But now, here he was, placing himself between flame and flesh for a girl no one had claimed. The girl's name was Mary Aloan, though few ever bothered to remember it. Her mother had died 2 winters prior, her father lost in a mining collapse before that. She lived on the edge of town, selling herbs and wild honey, healing sick animals when no vet would come. That made her strange, suspicious, the kind of person people tolerated in peace, but sacrificed in panic. When the preacher's son fell ill and Mary's salve didn't work, it wasn't long before whispers turned into accusation, and accusations into execution. But Caleb had seen something different. He'd watched from a distance as Mary fed stray dogs and left bread for widows who had nothing. He'd seen how she wept alone by the river's edge, and how she sang softly to the earth as she planted flowers in the spring. She didn't curse the land. She gave it life. Caleb knew that kind of soul. His mother had been the same, gentle, misunderstood, and ultimately destroyed by the same kind of men, now demanding Mary's death. Preacher Olin, red-faced and trembling, stepped forward with his Bible raised like a weapon. She consorts with devils. Caleb, you stand with the damned. But Caleb said nothing. He didn't argue theology or plead for reason. He simply squeezed Mary's hand tighter, his silence more powerful than a sermon. And that silence cracked something open. An old man in the crowd lowered his torch. Then a woman behind him stepped back, eyes wet with shame. The town wasn't sure what it was witnessing, rebellion or redemption, but it was enough to make them pause. The sheriff, caught between duty and doubt, finally raised a hand. "Put the torches down," he ordered. His voice shook, not from fear of the crowd, but from fear that they might already be too far gone. Yet the command was enough. One by one, the flames dimmed as torches hit the dirt. No cheer followed, no apology, just silence. And in that silence, Mary stood taller. Not because she was safe, but because someone, finally, had said she was worth saving. Caleb led Mary away from the square, their hands still locked together, though neither spoke. The townspeople parted once more, not with awe, but with the discomfort of having watched something true and knowing they did nothing. Eyes dropped, boots shuffled. Guilt lingered like smoke long after the torches were gone. And in their wake, the two figures disappeared into the dusk, toward the hills that watched over Widow's Rest like old sentinels tired of seeing good people swallowed by fear. Back at his farmhouse, Caleb drew warm water from the well, letting Mary bathe her blistered feet. He didn't ask questions. She didn't offer stories. In the West, sometimes silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a language all its own. He prepared a meal, cornbread, beans, and coffee, and they ate slowly, still processing what they had just escaped. Mary watched the flames in the hearth, as if trying to replace the memory of the ones meant to take her. That night, thunder rolled over the plains, but no rain came. Just the low growl of the sky that had seen too much. Caleb sat on the porch, smoking a pipe carved by his grandfather, while Mary slept inside wrapped in a quilt too big for her frame. He thought of the crowd, of the preachers shaking hands, of the way no one had said her name aloud during the whole ordeal. Fear, he realized, was louder than truth in Widow's Rest, and if left unchecked, it would rise again. By morning, Mary was already awake, tending the garden behind Caleb's house. She moved like someone who had known danger too long to rest. But her hands were steady. She hummed softly as she touched each leaf, whispering the names of the herbs under her breath. Caleb watched from the kitchen window, a mug of black coffee warming his palms, and realized something profound. The land wasn't just safer with her on it. It was better, brighter, more alive. But peace is never free in the West. Word traveled fast. By sundown, 3 men from the town council arrived at Caleb's gate. They wore dusty coats, and polite smiles stretched too tight over their teeth. "We just want to talk," one of them said, stepping down from his horse. Caleb didn't move. He only leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Behind him, Mary stood still, her hand resting on the eagle feather Caleb had hung above the hearth years before. This time, they wouldn't come with torches. They came with promises, and threats dressed as concern. Caleb had a choice to make once more. But he already knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The man in front, Walter Brigsby, the mayor's cousin, smiled like someone used to being obeyed. "We understand emotions were high last night," he began, choosing his words with caution. "But harboring a suspected witch, Caleb, that sets a dangerous precedent." Caleb didn't blink, didn't speak, just stared through the man until his smile started to crack. Walter cleared his throat and gestured toward Mary. "She's welcome to leave town quietly. No one wants more trouble." But it wasn't concern in his voice. It was fear, not of Mary, but of what it meant for one man to defy the herd and walk away unscathed. Mary stepped forward, but Caleb gently raised his hand, stopping her. He met Walter's eyes and said, "She's not going anywhere." His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of something immovable. "You don't get to burn the truth and call it mercy." Walter's jaw tightened, and for a second, the illusion of diplomacy fell. "You're choosing her over this town?" Caleb took a breath. "No, I'm choosing what's right over what's easy. That's what this town used to mean." The councilman left without another word, but Caleb knew it wasn't the end. Men like them didn't give up, they regrouped. And fear, when wounded, has a way of returning with sharper teeth. But for now, the farmhouse was still, the air around it lighter. Mary resumed her work in the garden, this time planting a row of sage near the fence. Caleb returned to his fields, every step heavy with the awareness that the land wasn't just being worked, it was being defended. Over the next few days, whispers grew. Some townsfolk came to the edge of Caleb's property just to catch a glimpse of the girl who hadn't burned. Children asked questions their parents didn't know how to answer. Some women quietly left pies on the porch, ashamed of what they'd stood by and allowed. Others crossed the street when they saw Caleb in town, not because they hated him, but because they didn't know what to say to a man who reminded them of their own silence. Then came the first warning sign. Caleb found one of his fences slashed clean through, barbed wire torn and posts burned. No tracks, just malice. He patched it without a word, but he didn't sleep that night. Mary sat by the window, watching the dark fields with eyes that had seen too much fire for one lifetime. Caleb sat beside her, rifle across his lap, not out of fear, but out of promise. If they were coming again, they would not come unchallenged. And this time, it would not end in silence. 2 nights later, the dogs barked, not the playful yelps of alert, but a long, guttural warning that came from the marrow of instinct. Caleb rose from his bed, grabbed the lantern, and opened the front door to a sky painted in red and black. His barn was ablaze, flames tearing through the roof, hay snapping like bones under fire. He didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply turned to Mary and nodded. She understood instantly. The barn was lost, but the line had been crossed. As the fire raged, shadows gathered at the edge of the field. Caleb could see them, 5, maybe 6 men on horseback, watching from a distance, hidden behind the illusion of darkness. They didn't attack, didn't move closer. They only watched, as if waiting to see what would break first, the man or the girl. But neither broke. Caleb stood with his back straight, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. Mary stood beside him, calm and still, the flames reflected in her eyes, not with fear, but with clarity. The next morning, the sheriff came. He was weary, ashamed, but not blind. He'd seen the fire from town. "I can't prove it was them," he said, looking down. "But I know who it was." Caleb didn't ask for names. He didn't want arrests. He wanted something far rarer, truth. "Then tell them this," he said. "If they come again, I won't be the only one standing here." The sheriff met his eyes. "You expecting help?" Caleb turned to Mary, who was feeding the chickens like it was any other day. "No, I already have it." The days that followed weren't quiet, but they were purposeful. Caleb began reinforcing the house, not with walls or locks, but with presence. Friends he hadn't seen in years rode in from distant homesteads. Old war companions, traitors, outcasts, people who'd known what it meant to be hunted for being different. They didn't ask questions. They just took their place on the land beside him. The farmhouse became more than a home. It became a line drawn in soil, not to divide, but to protect. And while the town wrestled with its guilt, the fire's smoke lingered as a reminder, not of destruction, but of survival. Mary continued her work, treating sick livestock, offering herbs to those brave enough to come. Caleb returned to the field every morning, plowing soil that now bore witness to both hatred and hope. The West had always been a place where justice came late, if at all. But sometimes it came in the form of a farmer who refused to let fear make the rules. Autumn crept in, brushing the fields with gold and rust. The wind carried a cooler edge, and with it, a strange calm settled over Widow's Rest. Those who had once shouted for fire now lowered their voices in shame when they passed the church steps. Caleb noticed it. How people averted their gaze. How conversations hushed when he entered the mercantile. Not from hostility, from the burden of knowing they had stood by while a girl nearly burned. Guilt, he realized, was heavier than hatred. It lingered long after the flames had gone out. Mary, however, bloomed like the fall wildflowers that grew behind the barn's charred skeleton. She walked through town with her head high, not because she felt safe, but because she refused to be unseen again. Children watched her with quiet wonder. Some followed her down the path, asking questions about roots and remedies. And when the preacher's youngest daughter fell sick, it was Mary the family sent for, hushed, humble, and desperate. She came without anger, without hesitation. Inside that small, cold house, Mary placed her satchel on the table and knelt beside the bed. The girl burned with fever, her breath shallow. Mary crushed dried leaves with fingers that had once trembled before a crowd of would-be executioners. Now, they moved steady, guided by instinct and something deeper, grace. When the girl's eyes fluttered open 2 days later, it wasn't just the child who had been healed. It was the first stitch in a town that had been torn apart by fear and stitched back together with courage. The preacher came to Caleb's farm alone, unarmed, unannounced. He removed his hat, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights and too many unanswered prayers. "I was wrong," he said, the words catching like splinters in his throat. "I let fear wear the mask of faith." Caleb didn't offer absolution. That wasn't his to give. He only stepped aside, allowing the man to pass through and speak with Mary himself. The moment wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, honest, and in the West, that was rarer than rain. But not everyone welcomed the change. Whispers still crept through saloons, sharpened by pride and resentment. Men who felt their power fading began to speak again, this time not with fire, but with plans. They didn't fear Mary's herbs or Caleb's rifle. They feared what they represented, a new order. One where truth had hands, where kindness had teeth, and where no one would ever again be burned simply because they were different. The silence before had been fear. This silence now was preparation. It was near the end of harvest when the challenge came. Not with fire or fists, but with ink. A petition circulated through Widow's Rest. A call to exile Caleb and Mary under the guise of restoring order. Peace through distance, they called it. A quiet removal. No torches this time, just signatures. The paper passed from hand to hand, and each mark was a reminder that even after everything, some hearts remained hard. But when the parchment reached the sheriff's desk, he refused to sign. So did the schoolteacher. So did the widow who once crossed the street to avoid Mary. And then something unexpected happened. One by one, people began to cross out their names. In the saloon, in the store, on back porches lit by lanterns, they scratched away their consent. Not out of fear of Caleb, but out of shame. Out of the slow, stubborn realization that what they nearly allowed could never be undone, but it didn't have to be repeated. The paper ended up torn in half and thrown into the river. Some said it was Mary who tossed it. Others swore it was the sheriff. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the sound it made when it hit the water and vanished. That same week, Caleb rebuilt the barn with help from those who had once watched it burn. The blacksmith lent his hammer. The banker's son carried beams. Even the preacher hauled nails with blister hands. Mary brewed tea for the workers, her laughter rising over the hammer blows like a hymn. No speeches, no grand apologies, just labor, just men and women trying, in the only way they knew how, to say, "We remember, we were wrong, we're still here." But redemption has enemies. That night, a rider appeared from the neighboring county, a man dressed in black, bearing a silver star that hadn't seen a badge in years. His name was Jonas Thorne, a bounty hunter turned moral enforcer, hired by those too proud to let the past die quietly. He asked for Mary by name, claimed he had legal cause to remove her. No warrant, no court, just cold eyes and a promise of violence if he wasn't obeyed. Caleb met him at the gate, rifle in hand, the wind whispering through the tall grass like a warning. "She's not going anywhere," he said. Jonas dismounted, smiled, and said, "Then neither are you." Behind Caleb, Mary stepped forward, not to hide, but to stand beside him once again, the same way he had once stood for her. The wind picked up. The ground seemed still. The West, after all, never forgets the weight of a standoff. And this time, it was the soul of a town, not just the life of one girl, that hung in the balance. Jonas Thorne stood in the fading light, dust clinging to his boots, fingers twitching near the revolver on his hip. The air was heavy, like it knew a single wrong word could ignite something that wouldn't burn out easy. Caleb didn't blink. He'd faced storms, wolves, and starvation. This man with his polished belt buckle and crooked code wasn't half as dangerous. Mary stood beside him, her chin lifted, her gaze locked onto Thorne's. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. What she feared had already tried to kill her. What remained was clarity. Thorne took one step forward. "I ain't here to start a war, farmer. I'm here to end a mistake." Caleb's voice was calm, but carved from stone. "Then you've already failed." Behind them, the sound of footsteps approached, boots crunching on dry dirt. One by one, figures emerged from the trees and barn. Friends, neighbors, people who had once stayed silent now stood side by side in the twilight. They weren't armed. They didn't shout, but their presence was louder than any gunshot. Sheriff Harlan arrived last, riding hard and stopping at the gate. He dismounted, badge catching the final glow of sunlight. "You don't speak for this town, Thorne," he said, "and you don't decide who belongs here." Thorne looked around, measuring the odds, not in bullets, but in will. He saw it now. Widow's Rest was no longer the place where you could accuse a girl and watch her burn. It had changed, and that change had teeth. For a moment, it seemed Thorne might draw, that the dust would rise and someone would fall. But instead, he spat to the side, adjusted his hat, and turned back to his horse. "This ain't over," he muttered. Caleb replied without raising his voice. "It is here." And with that, the man who came with the weight of law, but none of its soul, rode off into the coming dark. He didn't look back. Maybe because he didn't want to see what real justice looked like when it finally stood its ground. That night, no one celebrated. There were no drinks raised, no songs sung, just lanterns burning in every window, and the quiet hum of wind weaving through fences and leaves. Peace had returned, but it wasn't handed down. It had been chosen, protected, earned. Caleb sat on his porch, Mary beside him, and the others slowly faded into the night, leaving behind the echo of a promise that this land would no longer bow to fear disguised as righteousness. The next morning, Widow's Rest woke to a stillness that felt different, not the silence of dread, but of healing. The barn now stood strong again, its frame cut from wood carried by many hands. The garden behind the farmhouse thrived, and Mary's herbs bloomed like they had been waiting for the land to forgive itself. Children returned to her with questions and laughter, and parents no longer whispered warnings, but asked her how to treat fevers, how to make pain fade without poison. Caleb continued his routine, rising with the sun, tending the fields, fixing what needed fixing. But something in his eyes had shifted. A quiet peace had replaced the weight he'd carried for years. He still kept his rifle by the door, but it was no longer for fear. It was a symbol now, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous man in town is the one willing to stand still when the world demands he turn away. Mary, too, had changed. Her silence was no longer a defense. It was a choice. She spoke when she wanted, when it mattered. Her voice carried weight, not because of its volume, but because it had been nearly silenced forever. Now, the same town that once wanted her gone had started to call her healer, seer, wise woman. The titles didn't matter to her. Only the trust behind them did. Autumn rolled into early winter, and the land began to rest. Snow would come soon. Caleb stacked firewood near the cabin while Mary dried herbs for the cold months ahead. No one knew what the future would bring. The West had always been wild, unpredictable. But something had changed, something unspoken and deep. Widow's Rest was no longer just a dot on a map. It was a place where people remembered, where one man held a girl's hand, and in doing so, pulled an entire town back from the edge. And so the story traveled, carried by traders, travelers, and passing strangers. It became a tale told by firesides, on porches, and in hushed tones late at night. They all began the same way. They were going to burn her, until a loner farmer stepped forward. Some added details. Others softened the ending. But one truth always remained. Sometimes in the wildest parts of the world, the bravest thing a man can do is simply stand still and refuse to let someone burn. Snow began to fall lightly in late November, cloaking the hills around Widow's Rest in silence. The town grew quieter, huddling in on itself as cold seeped into every window and bone. But inside Caleb's farmhouse, the hearth burned steady. The warmth there was not just from firewood, but from something deeper, earned peace. Mary sat at the table, stringing dried lavender and chamomile for tinctures, her hands calm and sure. She no longer glanced at the door with worry. She had roots now. She had home. People still came to her, more now than ever, not just for medicine, but for guidance. A mother who had once spat at her feet, now came asking how to soothe her child's nightmares. A rancher whose name had been on the petition brought her honeycomb and left it without a word. No one apologized outright. The West didn't work that way. But change doesn't always arrive with confessions. It shows up in gestures, in offerings, in silence that no longer stings. Caleb noticed it too, in the way folks greeted him now. Not with pity, not with distance, but with the subtle nod of shared respect. He hadn't become a hero. He didn't want to be. But they saw him differently now. They saw what one act could do, what one refusal to let fear decide could ignite. Not violence, but courage. His days were still filled with work, hauling hay, mending the barn, walking fence lines. But they were also filled with visits, shared meals, and small laughter that echoed across the porch like a promise kept. Then, one evening near the end of the year, a stranger arrived, old, wrapped in a blanket woven in Apache patterns, leaning heavy on a carved cane. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at Mary and nodded once, slowly. Then, in a voice thick with age and memory, he said, "I heard about the fire that never was." Mary looked into his eyes and smiled, not because she needed his approval, but because she understood what he meant. Stories in the West traveled fast, and when they carried truth, they became legend. That night, the old man shared bread with Caleb and Mary. He didn't ask for shelter, though he was offered it. Before leaving, he handed Mary a single stone etched with an old tribal symbol for protection. "Keep it near," he said, "for not all fires burn wood, and not all enemies ride horses." She nodded, then handed him a pouch of healing herbs in return. Nothing more needed saying. In the Old West, sometimes two people exchanged everything without speaking a single word. Winter deepened, and with it came a sense of closure. Not an ending, but a full circle drawn carefully in the snow. Widow's Rest endured the cold as it always had, but something was different that season. The church bell rang not just for funerals and Sunday sermons, but for births and weddings. The tavern echoed with less bitterness, more laughter, and Mary's name was spoken with warmth now. Mary Aloan, the healer. Not witch, not burden, not silence. Caleb kept working the land, year after year. Some winters were harsh, some springs were dry, but his home always had firewood stacked high and coffee brewing before dawn. Mary stayed beside him through it all, her hands shaping the earth, healing the wounded, tending to the young. They were never married in a church, never wore rings. But the town called her his wife just the same, and Caleb never corrected them. Because sometimes, love in the West wasn't loud. It was steady. It was earned. Years passed, and new faces arrived in Widow's Rest. Families seeking land, wanderers seeking peace. Some came because they'd heard the story. Others came by chance. But all found a town shaped by the memory of that fire that never was. Children were raised on the tale, not of witches, but of the farmer who stood still, and the girl who survived the flames through nothing but the strength of one man's hand. When Caleb passed, quietly, in his sleep, with Mary's hand resting in his, every building in town lowered its lanterns. They buried him on a hill that overlooked the farm, wrapped in the same coat he wore that night by the pyre. And beside his grave, Mary planted sage and wildflowers. She didn't cry. She didn't break. She just whispered, "Thank you," and let the wind carry the rest. And so, the legend lived on, not carved into stone, but etched into hearts. The West had been built by men with guns and grit, but changed by those who dared to choose mercy over fear. And to this day, in the quieter corners of the land, folks still tell the story of the girl who was supposed to burn and the farmer who held her hand and changed everything. In the end, this wasn't just a story about fire and fear. It was a story about the moment someone refused to look away. Caleb Ward didn't save a life with speeches or gunfire. He saved it with presence, with a hand held out in silence. And that single act shattered centuries of superstition and fear that had gripped not just a town, but a way of thinking. Because in the Old West, where legends are born in blood and grit, true bravery often comes quietly, without a badge, without an audience, just a man doing what's right when it matters most. Mary Aloan's life could have ended that night, but instead, it became something far greater. Her survival wasn't just a victory over fire. It was a rebirth for an entire community. The girl they nearly burned became the heart they never knew they needed. And as she healed others, she also healed the land, proving that even the deepest wounds can bloom again, if someone is willing to protect the root. Caleb gave her that chance, and in return, she gave meaning to everything he had built. This tale teaches us that the most profound changes don't begin in courtrooms or battlefields. They begin at the edges of a crowd, when one person chooses to step forward and say, "Enough." It reminds us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, but presence, simple, unwavering presence, can rewrite the future. Caleb's hand didn't just stop a flame. It lit a path for all who came after him, showing that courage isn't loud, it's loyal. So ask yourself, in a world quick to judge and quicker to condemn, would you have stepped forward? Would you have held her hand when it could have cost you everything? Or would you have watched, silently, like so many did, hoping someone else would speak first? Sometimes, the weight of history hangs on a single decision, and the stories we pass down aren't about the ones who shouted the loudest, but the ones who stood when it mattered. If this story moved you, stay close. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this tale with someone who still believes in decency, in courage, in redemption. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we keep the fire of memory alive, so that when the next moment comes, we remember what it means to stand beside the flame, not feed it.